Welcome to this lecture on Jesus' second missionary sermon, or maybe I should say Jesus' missionary sermon. That would be better because this is his second major sermon, and it's about him sending out the disciples as missionaries, found in Matthew chapter 10, verses 1 through 11:1. 11.1 is just kind of an inclusio, and I actually don't include it into the larger body of this lecture, but you'll see how it kind of functions as a final conclusion to this second sermon. The clarifying mission, it really does, this is Jesus kind of telling his disciples what they should, how they should go about delivering the good news to the larger community. What to take as their preparations, and what to expect when they get there. So it's a real interesting sermon compared to the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount was basically Jesus saying, "This is how I interpret the law," which functions as a way for the community that would follow Jesus how they should kind of interpret the law, and that interpretation is different than how it's been interpreted before. So it's kind of a new interpretation that Jesus gives, and his community is called to follow those teachings and believe in the same way that Jesus believes. So you've heard this been said, don't do X, Y, Z. Well, I tell you, and then Jesus kind of heightens this sense of obedience. If you heard it's been said, walk a mile for somebody, I'm telling you to walk 2 miles, that kind of stuff. So Jesus now turns from that sermon to the second one and gets even more specific about how the disciples are supposed to do ministry. But it's not just about the disciples. It actually is about Matthew's community. Remember, Matthew's writing this after the Jewish war. Jerusalem's been destroyed. Jews have been scattered around the Roman Empire. Matthew's trying to, minister to a group of people in Antioch of Syria, which is not in Jerusalem. Many of them will have remembered the war or have went through the war, and now they're almost like refugees outside of their hometown. And in that community, in that Jewish community, these Jews believe differently. They believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and they believe in this new interpretation of the law. So not only are they ostracized or kicked out or exiled from their homeland by the Romans, in this new arena, they have a different belief than their local brothers and sisters in the Jewish community. So they are doubly ostracized in that sense. And this sermon speaks to that community in some profound ways, gives them kind of capacity to understand their situation as not something that is unusual or something that is wrong. It alleviates the idea that they've done something wrong to deserve the persecution that they are receiving. This is actually just the opposite. Here Jesus says you should expect that. So let's kind of get into it. This is how the sermon this sermon kind of breaks down in verse by verse, and it's also directly taken from Mark. Almost this entire piece is a construction from teachings of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. And Matthew expands that into something much larger, as you can see from how many verses he uses there to kind of take that into a larger setting. So he's using Mark, obviously, as a resource here and a source when he's writing this chapter and putting this sermon onto the lips of Jesus. So here you can see the authority. This whole section kind of talks about the authority given to the disciples, or probably apostles is a better word. From the very beginning, he authorizes them to cast out unclean spirits and to cure every kind of illness. Sorry for the typo there. In other words, Jesus sends them out to do the ministry that Jesus has been doing. So he's not asking them to do more than what he's already done. He's just given them authority to do the same thing. So there's nothing unusual about this authority to do it because they've already seen him do it. And then before he goes any farther, he names the 12 apostles. And the word apostle simply means those who are sent. Apostolo is the Greek word that means to send. So these are the first disciples. And their order in this list is very important and says something about Matthew, right? So the first, and he actually says first here, the first is Simon, who is also called Peter. He starts with Simon because that's a Jewish name. Peter is more of a Greek name. So it even says, that the number one disciple, and Matthew will concentrate on Peter throughout. Peter's always the best of the crowd, of the 12 apostles. He's always more, has a deeper faith. He's used as an example over and over and over again in the Gospel of Matthew. So he has priority in his stories. And then Andrew is just only known as Peter's brother. And then James, son of Zebedee, and John, which is James's brother. Now that's interesting too because the Gospel of John was also a major disciple. And people end up following. He ends up being one of the top 3 leaders in Jerusalem after Jesus' death, according to the Acts of the Apostles. And so there's always this kind of Peter-John rival. And notice how the order here. So in order to kind of make John's role less, he says James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. So John is not only in a secondary position to Peter, he's actually in a secondary position to his own brother James. So this is worth noting. And then Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, these are all, again, all these are Jewish names. Matthew, they give no explanation for Philip, Bartholomew, and Thomas either. They just name them. Matthew is given as a tax collector because we've already talked about his conversion and how his double role as tax collector in the Roman Empire. But it's important to this gospel in particular because this is the Matthew that we think, or the name associated with the writer of this gospel is this guy. That's generally how people think about it, because in other Gospels it's Levi instead of Matthew, so that's just worth knowing. Then James, son of Alphaeus, and son of Alphaeus is given only to differentiate him from the son of Zebedee. Thaddeus, without mention. Simon, this is not the Canaanite, so don't think of it like this. This is most likely an Aramaic word for zealot, and even in the other Gospels it says Simon the Zealot. So this would have been a radical political figure. In the writings of Josephus, it was these people he called zealots who started the Jewish-Roman War. So you have in this group so far some pretty standard people, but between a zealot and a tax collector, you couldn't get more different. Tax collectors were Roman puppets that were extracting money from their own people, and a zealot would be somebody who would absolutely want to militarily overthrow the Roman government, and any of those tax collectors that were part of it. So in real life, outside of this disciple crowd, Matthew and Simon would have been utter enemies, right? But here they're both in this group. And then Judas is mentioned last, and that's not, and he has a Judas Iscariot. He has a double name, which is unusual in this group. But he's also labeled as the one who betrayed Jesus. So from Peter to Judas, it's listed kind of in their order of importance. not just their chronology. But again, Peter has priority here. The other thing that's noticed is that all these names are Jewish. Matthew always starts from a Jewish perspective. These original ones were all Jewish. It would speak to his audience, who the Matthew's community is a Jewish community who are believers in Jesus, that struggle with the inclusion of Gentiles, but they also struggle with their place within larger Judaism, and that's exactly how the gospel. This is one of the main issues the Gospel of Matthew deals with. So to start the sermon in earnest, you have the mission in 5:15. He says, "Don't go to Gentiles or Samaritans, only the lost sheep of Israel." So while Gentiles are included later on, and used as examples of great faith, they are not the primary audience. And Matthew kind of reiterates that over and over again. And even when Gentiles are allowed in, it's really reluctantly. So the primary mission is to Israel, and then proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Kingdom of heaven is kind of an operative within the larger gospel about how Matthew thinks that the Jesus movement is different than the rest of Judaism. And in verse 8 is basically saying, use your authority generously. Be generous with what you have. Take no provisions except to be taken care of. So don't take anything, but expect those who you work to, those to whom you minister, expect that they will take care of you. And so this stay with one who's worthy, unless your peace come upon it. If you're not welcome, leave. This is speaking it's not just Jesus speaking to those who send it out. This is Matthew speaking to his community. In other words, he knows how hard it is for them to be in Antioch as Jewish exiles or refugees. But even in that moment, he's like, stay with those who are worthy, and let your peace come upon them. Give them peace. But if you're not welcome, leave. And so this is going to run throughout this whole sermon, this double space. Jesus speaking to his disciples, and then Matthew using that to speak to his own community. And what happens if these towns don't accept the apostles? The judgments will come to these towns. So the mission is from the very beginning. You're going to the lost sheep of Israel. Don't take anything with you, and those who welcome you, give them your peace, and those who don't worry about them. They're not. It's not going to be good for them in the end. And so he moves from that, like, this is where you're going, and then this is what don't worry. This is what you should take. But now it's like, this is what you should expect. And he starts in this section with the expecting persecution, your sheep among wolves. And then this idea of being handed over in 17:18, handed over to authorities. And then when you get there, 19 through 20, it's like, don't worry about what to say, because the Holy Spirit's going to give them the words to say. So already, just jumping into this section, there's clear evidence here that Matthew is speaking directly to his community about what they should expect. In other words, the persecution that they are currently facing in Antioch, not just from the Romans, but from their own Jewish brothers and sisters who are kicking them out of the local synagogue because of their beliefs about Jesus. That's part and parcel of what it means to be a disciple. Matthew says that that's exactly how Jesus sent his disciples out, and even his disciples were handed over to courts and stuff. just like Jesus was handed over. So the pattern is Jesus, this stuff happened to Jesus. The disciples should expect to have that because it happened to Jesus, and it did. And then, so Matthew's telling his community, and guess what? It happened to Jesus, it happened to the disciples, it happened to us. So, you know, it's part of being a disciple. And so, while this is a missionary sermon, a sermon about how to go out, it's also a sermon to his local community, saying, "Guys, this is part of what it means. You know, what you're going through is terrible, but it's part of um, what it means to be a follower of Jesus." So when you are handed over, don't worry about what to say. God will give you what to say. And then he gets into like divisions within families. Now, this will reappear in a latter section of the sermon. And this is important because it's not just um, Jewish believers in Jesus and Jewish non believers in Jesus. This is happening within families themselves, where if somebody within a family said, I'm going to be a follower of Jesus, that's how I'm going to be Jewish, that family would really kind of give them a hard time, it seems. And this, again, is happening in real life. And Matthew's putting this on the lips of Jesus to console them in some profound ways. And they shouldn't, stand and fight or anything like that. Just like the Sermon on the Mount that said, love your enemies. Here, when persecutions come, run away from them. Get away. You don't have to allow yourself to be persecuted, but you aren't supposed to fight back either. So Jesus says, flee persecution. And in 24 through 25, it reiterates discipleship follows Jesus' ministry. It's not fundamentally different, and that's true to the disciples. These are these first 12 apostles, and it's true of Matthew's community. So we notice how this directly relates to Matthew's current community, who's facing all this persecution. So it's Matthew has Jesus predicting this for his own 12 apostles. And in doing so, Matthew's caring for a community that's already facing this in real time. So expect persecution is, the second section of the sermon. And as soon as he says expect persecution, he goes into this do not fear. And again, this is kind of a pastoral note, right? Don't be afraid of the following circumstances of persecution. Verse 28, fear the one who has real power. So those who have the power to destroy the body but can't do anything about the soul, don't worry about them. Their authority doesn't come from God, and their authority is limited. But you should fear the one who has the power to destroy the soul. Now, that is a powerful word to those who are contemplating, giving up their belief in Jesus or doing something less with it. Here, he says, power. Fear the one who actually has real power here. And then he uses this illustration of sparrows and hairs on your head, and this is almost his like stereotypical God is in control. You can buy 2 sparrows for a penny and one of them dies. God knows all the hairs on your head. But he's basically saying that you're part of a larger picture here, and bad things are just a part of it. It's not just a part of it, it's an integral part of it that should be understood and accepted. And then he gets into acceptance of the disciples equals acceptance of Jesus, as well as denial. And this will kind of be a permeating thing throughout. So if people accept the disciples and accept their message, then they're not just accepting the disciples, they're accepting Jesus. And it's just the same with Matthew's community, right? Again, it's more pastoral care. of people who are facing local persecutions for their belief in Jesus. He says, don't be afraid of these persecutions. That's going to happen. But while that's happening, God knows every hair in your head. And at the end of the day, those who accept you are accepting Jesus, and those who deny you are actually denying Jesus too. So this do not fear or it should be kind of like fear the right thing, right? And then he'll go back into what he just said before the do not fear part, with even a stronger statement that Jesus hasn't come to bring peace but a sword. Now that has been used out of context to justify all kind of terrible military stuff. But it's important for Jesus to say this here because the community has felt like they've been cut in half. The community that Matthew's talking to, these guys have suffered. They feel ostracized. They don't belong in the Roman world, and now they don't belong in their own Jewish world. And they have angst, and it's all because of their belief in Jesus. And here he says, that's okay. That's part of it, right? I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. And then in 35 through 36, he actually uses Micah 7:6 and continues to talk about how this internal family strife thing that he did used in the previous section, right? So now it looks like this is the previous section redone. And he basically says you can't love your father and more than God. And so 37 is this strong, the idea of you got to love God over your family, which again is can be used out of context in some terrible ways. But in all actuality, families were being ripped apart. If you believed in Jesus and your family didn't, it caused real strife. And that's the strife that Matthew's community was dealing with, and this speaks directly to them. And then you get into taking up the cross. That's what this whole thing has been about. Jesus would bear a cross, and the apostles were called to bear that cross. And if you're going to be a believer living in Antioch after the Jewish war, then guess what? You have a cross to bear too. And that all is wrapped into those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life will find it. It is this capacity to disassociate oneself from what is easy and do the hard thing. So this continues to help the community focus on staying loyal to their belief in Jesus, even when their family members harass them and threaten them. So they're kind of facing persecution at all level, at the Roman imperial level, at their religious level within Judaism, and then now even in their familial level, they're facing all these issues, and this is speaking to them directly. Like, it's okay, maintain the faith. You're doing what's wrong, and don't worry about what's coming. Don't fear this. And then Jesus ends this second major sermon on an up note, which is nice because it's been pretty heavy so far. And ends kind of reiterating some other things, but using this idea of welcome. Those who welcome you, those will welcome Jesus. And it turns from those who would persecute to those who would receive, right? So now he's not warning against or telling them about those who are going to turn them over. Now he's talking about those who are going to receive them. So just like you're going to be, not welcome, there are going to be places that welcome you. And when you're welcomed by them, Jesus welcomes them. And that is a profound thing for them to help to realize that they have the capacity within themselves to be the presence of Christ in their community. And if their community doesn't want them, that's tough on that's going to be bad for their community. It's not going to be bad for them. And then he ends with 41 and 42 saying, by receiving the disciples, the community receives Christ. And this is the preferred place, right? So when it's all said and done, Jesus ends his second sermon on a positive note, but clearly outlines to whom the disciples are sent and what they should expect as they go. This absolutely helps the Matthews community understand their own current situation about being kicked out of their local synagogue, about their family strife, and it shows how their belief strains those family relationships, but that faith itself is what's most important. And this is how, in this second sermon, this is how the Gospel of Matthew functions overall. The Gospel of Matthew is teaching them about Jesus, teaching them about his ministry, but the whole time he's saying this is why it's relevant for what you're facing today. If you have any questions about chapter 10, Jesus' second major sermon, please feel free to send me an email. I'll try to be as clear as possible. And look for all the other assignments that are coming up in class. Peace.